Welcome to The Right Approach. We are your hosts. I'm JW Judge, and with me is Barbara Hinske, my co-host. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every week. And our topic today is about making sure you have compelling antagonists. Everybody wants to focus on having compelling protagonists, but the bad guys have to be worth being there too. And so we're going to talk about that today. Before we jump into that topic, let's start with personal writing updates. So Barb, what's going on in your world?
Well, so thank you for asking. After the last time I think we talked and I updated, I had gotten feedback from my writing coach that one of my main scenes fell completely flat, sent me back to the drawing board. So I dusted myself off and have spent a lot of time doing that. It's much improved. I've finished the first draft of the fourth book in my Guiding Emily series, and I'm now going back. It was a lot of writing in a week, and I knew I was going to have to go back and address my shortcomings, which are detail and emotional content. For somebody who writes sweet romance, I hate writing the lovey-dovey stuff. Let me put a shiv in somebody all day long and I'm all over that, but it is just crazy. So I've been working on that, and we'll do more of that today as I layer in those things. And then I'll send it to my editor by Sunday night, and Tuesday we'll talk, and hopefully by Tuesday I will have gotten there. We'll see. How about you? What are you on?
Well, let me follow up with the question. So is that an intentional part of your process? Like, you go through the first draft knowing I'm going to have to go back and add these things in to give it color?
Not so much. I try to work on that as I go along, and I've gotten better. But I knew when I was finishing up the bare bones of what was going to happen, which it's a wedding at the end of this book, which, I mean, the name of the book is, the title is going to be Down the Aisle. So I don't think anybody has got no spoiler alerts that we are going to have a wedding in this book. So, by 2:00 Sunday afternoon, you got another 5,000 words to go to finish the book. You're bound and determined it's going to happen. I think, all right, we're going to just lay out plot bones and fill in the meat later. So that part was intentional. But as I go along, I don't think, okay, the whole draft is going to suffer from the malady. I'm not a detailed person. If I come as a reader, if I find a big stretch of descriptive prose, there was one book I read, I can't remember the name of it now, but anyway, there were 3 pages of the bird songs as this person was walking through the forest, and I'm, just kill me now, skip. But I realize in order to have any sort of resonance with readers, you do have to set a vibrant scene. So
Yeah, and I have, well, I won't say always. So when I was in my 20s, I loved Ernest Hemingway, who I haven't read in probably 20 years now. But I wanted to write like that, which led to a lot of overwriting and bad writing. And then I quit doing creative writing for a while. Just life got in the way, and came back to it probably really about 4 years ago. By then, I had done so much writing, even though it was nonfiction stuff, that I had really found my voice. And I had to find the fiction voice, but I knew who I was as a writer, and it didn't involve, like 7 consecutive paragraphs of description anymore.
yeah,
And that's not who readers are anymore.
No, you're right.
And so, yeah, when I see that too, when I come to a page that's just a wall of text, I have the same reaction of like, oh, geez, okay.
Yeah.
And so much of how I consume books now is audiobooks.
Yes, me too.
Which is really interesting because, first of all, you don't have the option to to skip through any of that. Like, you can just skim through it, and so it's a different experience. But yeah, a lot of my writing is somewhat Spartan as far as details go, because as with all your senses, and I know when I come back that I need to add to that so that it will be more immersive?
Yes, that is a good point. And I think today's writing demands that you have a rapid pace, no matter what the genre is. Even if you're not writing thrillers, you need to have pacing. You need people to want to turn that page. So you have to be careful about taking them out of the story to describe what's surrounding them. It's a delicate balance. I think a lot of the classics wouldn't be popular today.
Yeah.
They're
And
just
I
too.
try to do that through character movement or character actions and describe it by how it's affecting, the character,
Yeah.
rather than just going in and saying, okay, like here's the room they're in and all the things that I want you to know about it. I'm letting the reader mentally fill in a lot of those blanks and
Mhm.
giving enough pertinent information that they can I can do some of the work and then they can do the rest.
I think I mean, we could have a whole topic about this, about how you use your speech tags to really set the scene and describe and show rather than tell about your characters.
All right, I'm making a note because we definitely need to do that because people
Yeah.
hear show don't tell, but
Yes.
sometimes that's good advice and sometimes it's not, but also you
Yeah.
need to know what it means and how to apply it. We need to
Yeah,
do that.
I agree. Yep.
Um, so as far as what I've been doing, we are recording this in the middle of September, and for me, it has been a much more consistent month than
Good.
August was able to be. I looked today at my word count spreadsheet, and so it's September 16th. I've only missed 2 days as in the month of September for writing. And not all of them have been like most of them have not been big days. Most of them have averaged 300 to 400 words. Some have been, 120, 150, 170, whatever. But there are words getting on the page, and the story in this fourth novel is progressing.
Good for you.
And a couple other things about it that I have been intentional about in this fourth novel is, so in my first three, the third of which is coming out as we record in 4 days, most of my chapters were probably averaged between 1,700 and 2,000 words. Some went
Mhm.
up to 2,500, 2,600, but mostly that was kind of the top end of it.
Yeah.
After our conversation with David Ellis, I have been more intentional about keeping it between 1,200 and 1,500 words,
Yeah.
which is going to be, yeah, it's
Yeah.
going to be 5 to 8 pages a chapter. And then I'll go in and kind of assess when I finish if I like that. And, we'll see. But yeah, so I've been trying that. We'll see how it goes. So far, I've liked the pacing that it's given me. And another thing I've done is since our conversation with Kevin Tumlinson, I've also found a way to bring in a character out of my first series into this fourth book, which isn't otherwise related. And I don't think he's going to be a very central character, but it's a tie-in.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about that. That's smart. And kudos to you for the discipline to, even if you can only write, 170 words in a day, you didn't just say, oh, well, it's not worth it. I'm not going to do that. You did it. And I think that constant being in your novel makes you much more efficient as you keep going. So that's inspiring.
Well, and that's how I've had to do it.
Yeah.
And it's probably not ideal, but that's where I'm at. And so like even the other night I was at my 7-year-old's baseball practice and they were having a little bit of a downtime, and I had a thought about what came next in the chapter that I was in at the moment. So I just got out my phone and opened my Scrivener app and dropped 100 words into that. And then, it synced up with my laptop the next morning. And so it wasn't a huge chunk, but, it adds up. And
It
that's
adds up. Good for you. Yeah.
all right. Let's talk about antagonists. We write very different stories. And
Yeah.
I bet that our antagonists look different on the exterior and in their interactions, but I bet they have some similarities if they are good antagonists. So let's just start with what do you try? What do your antagonists look like in your stories? And I know that, that may differ from one genre to the next because you're involved in some different genres. So, what do antagonists look like for you? Let's just start with that.
So my antagonists, well, I've in my main series, Rosemont, has mobsters in them and some mafia people, and it has a a theme that gets resolved in the fifth book of political corruption and fraud and all of that, based upon some real small town fraud or medium city fraud. So these are people with some. One of my antagonists is very one dimensional and has really no redeeming qualities. He's the main mobster bad guy. I don't like to write people like that. I don't like to watch television shows where there's the bad guys are unredeemable. I love a redemptive character arc. So I also have a character called whose name is Frank Haynes, who is introduced with a soft spot for animals, and he funds and fosters the no-kill animal shelter in town. So I start him off. He's got all kinds of problems and engages in all kinds of bad behavior, shady things. Had a bad childhood, like many people do, but he's got this soft spot. And then I develop him over the books with a redemptive character arc. I know for myself, I want an antagonist that has something I can relate to and something that I can think, oh, there is a better nature in you that can be appealed to. But I realize that isn't always, I mean, look at House of Cards. There was almost nobody there
Yeah.
you could like, and that's, I don't watch Succession. I tried. I mean, I know it's nominated for a million Emmys, won a million Emmys, all that. But at least in that first season, I'm like, I don't like any of these people. They're all horrible. So I don't know. How do you feel about all that?
Well, it's funny you mentioned Succession because I bounced off of it the first time for that same reason of like all of these people are despicable. But then we tried it again several months later and really liked it, and have liked it. And there are there are people who are less unlikable than others, and there is nuance in some of the characters. There you end up with characters that you are pulling for, or who are, even if you're not pulling for them, who are clever or like interesting. And so that's what I want, is someone who, all right, is interesting. And so in my first novel, Vulcan Rising, there are two real antagonists. There's Vulcan, who is named after the Roman god, and there's also kind of his second in command. And Vulcan in the first novel, he doesn't have a lot of depth, and he's just power hungry, and that's kind of his motivation. The second in command, who's only known as the Warden, I feel like he has more depth because he has more history with Agatha, who is one of our two protagonists, and they have a prior relationship that is, I mean, it's there's a lot of bad blood there, but there's more depth to them. But I think they're interesting enough, that it's okay. But I knew that, I'm exploring. It was my first novel. I was still trying to figure all these things out. And so when I got to the second novel, I knew that it took me, first of all, and I think we've talked about this, a long time to figure out who my protagonist or my antagonist was going to be in the second novel, and I only figured it out through research, which we talked about it during the episode that we did about research. And so the antagonist in that second novel, I gave him some motivation as a religious zealot, and that was and gave you a whole bunch of his backstory as it relate, like, not unnecessarily, but as it relates to the plot and why he is who he is. And ultimately, more gets revealed as you go along. But I think I did a much better job of developing that, giving the reader a reason to understand who he is, his personal history, and the reason that he's committing the atrocities. And I don't justify it. I mean, he self-justifies it. But I, as the person writing it, I'm not saying, like, you should think this is okay, but you understand, like, here's why he thinks what he's doing is okay, or, his justification for it. So, I tried to add some more to it that way. But do you explore the your antagonist motivation and reasoning from their perspective at all, or how do you approach that?
Well, I certainly understand all of that deeply as the writer, and I do try to filter that in, especially with Frank Haynes, um my protagonist in the Rosemont series, that has this profound character arc, because the reader needs to buy in that this really bad guy is somebody that they're going to cheer for, to get the girl and to be happy and to find love. And he still has to make atonement for all that. I think it's important to not have a bad guy that just skates away from what he's done bad and, okay, well, nobody's going to find that out, I'm living a new life. No, I as a person want there to be some recompense. And so I do that. But as we're talking, in my Guiding Emily series, I have a husband who, when Emily loses her eyesight on her honeymoon, which is basically his fault, kind of, pretty much, and then he's clueless about how he really copes with a blind wife, and they end up breaking up. And I paint him very bad. You hate Connor in the first book. When I sold the screen rights and was talking with the producers, they said, boy, we if we could make one change, we'd have Connor not be so bad. We would make it a more complex deterioration of marriage. So when I wrote the second book, I changed him, and the marriage still ends up going away, but I flesh him out more with his own insecurities and his own backstory. And what helped me the most on that was seeing him differently myself, was listening to the audio version of the first book, because the narrator spoke him in a way that made me think, okay, well, he's not really that bad. It's still saying the same words I wrote, but it was an interesting dynamic. So I do think writers, maybe that's genre specific, but I think readers want to really know, if somebody's bad, why are they so bad? What's happened to them? So I think we got to do that as writers.
Yeah. And there's a certain, as a consumer, whether it's watching or reading, there are times when, in a situation like the husband in what you're describing, like, it can be written in a way where you're like, okay, yeah, he's a scoundrel, but also I understand that I too would not know how to cope with that situation and would have a hard time. And so, I think it makes sense there that if you soften that up a bit and, like, and put the reader, through that somebody can appreciate the struggle and still think he's kind of a dirtbag.
Yeah. And I think I, as a writer, learn a lot from watching programs on television to see how they handle those sorts of issues. I didn't get very far on Dexter, but from what I mean, he's a serial killer. Okay, in no universe is that fine, but people really understand him, and he's kind of like, as far as I understand, he's sort of a good kind of serial killer, which I object to that whole premise. In fact, there's a whole bunch of books in fiction now where and crawdads, heaven forbid I say anything negative about where the crawdads, but somebody gets killed and it's like, oh, okay, well, he had it coming. So we're supposed to be okay with that? No, I'm not
Yeah.
okay with that.
I may be a little more calloused because when that happened, I was like, okay, it's not okay, but also I don't really care. And so,
Yeah.
um, yeah, but I at the same time, I'm not justifying it, but there's a part of you that knowing that it's fiction, because in real life you'd never be like, well,
Oh, yeah.
but knowing that it's fiction, there's a part of you like, yeah, he did have it coming.
Yeah.
So, but so in my third book that's coming out here soon is called Forging Bonds, and we're back to Vulcan being the main antagonist in the book.
Mhm.
And so knowing that, I explored his backstory in Greek mythology, because I mean, Vulcan is his Roman name, but he's there's a Greek equivalent. And it's a truly like terrible backstory of his mother. He was so hideous at birth that his mother threw him into the sea, and then he was taken away and raised, and then he committed some atrocious acts. And so like, he was mistreated as a baby and as a child, which colored how he grew up. And so I brought that into the story of like him, like, this is how he became who he is. And none of what he does is okay, but here's how he got there. And
Mhm.
so it just added some of that backstory that if I had it, if I had the experience, I would have brought it into the first book, but didn't. And so I brought it into the third book. And when he is trying to justify some of his actions based on his upbringing, the person he is explaining that to like calls him out on it. Like, you want me to say it's okay just because somebody did terrible, terrible things to you. And so
Yeah.
I gave him more color than he had in the first one. And I thought it was really helpful for how that story developed.
Mhm. I think in life, we all want to understand when someone is acting out, whether it's a coworker or a neighbor in your HOA or something, somebody's just stirring the pot and raising hell. And most of us look at those situations, the coworker who can't get on with anybody, and you're thinking, what in the world? Why are you acting that way? And in life, we don't get to know oftentimes. But as writers, readers want to know, and we better at some point show that. And again, here we are back to showing it, because a big paragraph on, Vulcan was abandoned by his mother, blah, blah. I'm sure you didn't do that because nobody really wants that. You want to absorb it.
Yeah, what I try and do is my manuscripts are very dialogue intensive.
Yeah.
Um, and so I try to build so much of that into the interaction with characters. Um, and I want things like that as much as I can to come out in conversation, and not a forced conversation where it's just like you sit down over, dinner and like, let me tell you why I'm really ornery and terrible. But
Yeah.
that's how I like to bring out as much as I can, um, when it's bringing out the past or motivations. It's, for me, that's the most effective way for me to do it. And I know a lot of people are going to have different approaches on that. But you're right, of like just having a paragraph of, oh, by the way, this is a thing that happened, and I want you to know that because you need to know going forward is not super effective.
Is yeah, definitely not effective at all. Yeah, I personally like exposing all of that in timely dialogue. And oftentimes you have to pepper it in. You can't just have this big discussion, but two people are interacting and one of them snaps and the other comes back, and then you can kind of seed in a little bit, and then you have to drop it. You're not going to get the whole story there, but pay attention to where you're going to shortly later on in maybe a different scene, a different character interaction. You're going to load in a little more.
Yeah, because that's not the way it happens in real life. Like when I have when a disagreement with my spouse, or the kids, it doesn't all come out in one setting. It's you have the
Right.
blow up, and then everybody gets their space, and maybe like pieces of it are going to come out, but not always in a helpful way in the moment. And
Yes.
then later, when you're reconciling or trying to figure out what happened, and piece everything together, that's when you can have that conversation. But just info dumping it, even if it's in dialogue, like you said a minute ago, it's got to be timely dialogue, and it's got to happen in a way that is really natural, as opposed to, well, I'm the author and I need to get all this out, so I'm just going to do it in one go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's That's some of the really art of writing well, is knowing how to do that. And that's so crucial to making fiction that really resonates with people. Because we all have to have antagonists. If everybody's getting along just fine, it's a pretty ho-hum kind of book.
Yeah. So have you had any stories in which the antagonist was not a person, but was rather a force, or the weather, or some kind of event that wasn't human?
You know, I really haven't. But you have, haven't you? Tell us about that.
Well, I have, in that. So the second half of my third book really turned into a race against the clock kind of situation. And time became the antagonist, but it wasn't a finite amount of time, because everybody knew something bad was going to happen, but not when. And so it was, we have to get to our MacGuffin before time expires, but we're not sure exactly when that's going to happen. And so for me, that was all about trying to keep, and you had conflict built in. There was other conflict that I built in along the way, but um, I had to keep the pace fairly intensive to keep, the pressure's on anyway, but the characters need to feel it, and things keep needing to happen to create obstacles and put things in the way. But it was really, when I made the choice to do that, I wasn't certain how well. I hadn't done it before. And so
Mhm.
I was just kind of feeling my way through that. And I think it turned out really well. The people who have read it so far, have particularly talked about good pacing in the second half. And that's how, when you have something like that, and I thinking of a story that's not my own, you had that movie, The Perfect Storm. It's probably 20 years ago now, with George Clooney and some other guys, and they're fishermen, and they have these storm fronts that end up forming this terrible storm. And so you have lots and lots of stories where weather or events become
Yes.
the antagonists that aren't human. And so it's gonna change, and you have to figure out how to contend with that to keep things interesting for the reader.
As you're talking about the time antagonist, I think in one of my murder mysteries, Final Circuit, at the end, um, the protagonist is locked in a cooler at the mortuary, at the crematorium, that's got other, it's got coffins in it that are waiting to be cremated. The bad guy locks her in the cooler, and his plan is to cremate her, kill her and cremate her. And she knows this. And so her hobby is wiring up old antique toasters. And that's a real hobby. People collect antique toasters and they rewire them, and that's her hobby. So she figures out how she's going to electrocute him when he opens the freezer door. And so I have to describe all of that. And there is a timing thing because he's out there getting ready to open the door and kill her. And he can't overpower her. So that was an interesting thing to write. And I worked with electricians and electrical engineers and thought I had it right. And then found maybe I didn't have it right. A neighbor had her brother visiting him, who was a retired electrical engineer. And I gave him the pages. Oh my God, he was all over it. He went to Home Depot, bought wire, bought stuff, and it's fabulous. That was the way I got it right. And we sat there and I'm writing stuff and I said, is this it? Well, no, that isn't good. No, it won't arc like that. You got to do, and thank God for him, or I don't have the technical expertise in electricity to kind of write what I wanted to do, but it all worked out.
No, that's perfect though. That's such a good example of using resources at your disposal to help fill in your knowledge gaps.
Yeah.
And I think as writers, we're all going to come across writing things that we don't know enough about, but have to know how to get the answers, so that probably most of your readers aren't going to have known that either, but there are going to be those who do. And when they do, and they see that, it's going to be a turnoff, and it might result in a bad review. And so now you filled that knowledge gap with, there's plenty of ways to do it. And you had a real life person help you figure it out. I think that's really great.
Which was absolutely fabulous. Yeah. And particularly in writing mysteries or thrillers, these are the crossword puzzle people. And, they're really picky. If you make a mistake, they are going to find it and they will call you out for sure. Yeah. They should.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I think that brings us out of time for today. So I want to make sure and ask folks to leave a rating, review, subscribe, go to the rightapproachpod.com, and you can subscribe there, receive all the information about future episodes, find links to Barbara's website, to mine, if you want to look up the things that we've written. So thanks as always for listening, and we hope you enjoyed today's conversation.
Yeah.